And so I'm going to hand over now to David.
All right. Hello, everyone. It's a really great pleasure to be here today. Seeing that the time that's been allotted to us has been shortened slightly, I'll have to run through things a bit faster than I initially planned. So the research I'm presenting today is looking at persistence in the employability, and this is tied to a wage subsidy program that South Africa has been running since 2014, which is the Employment Tax Initiative. And we're just trying to explore how this program has potentially impacted on the outcomes of those who've gone through it vis-a-vis in comparison to those who haven't. This is the quick outline of what we'll be covering. And just a quick background. We know that South Africa is facing triple challenges of poverty, unemployment, and inequality. But what underpins most of this is the unemployment issue. And this is very, the burden mostly falls on the youth. So, and there's been quite a number of initiatives to try and find ways to solve this. Within that, you have the ETI program. And this has been going on for some time. There's been a number of studies that have looked at the ETI program and how it's impacted on the structure of the labor market, how it affects the probability of the youth getting new jobs. But a lot of them have really focused on, say, employment level effects. So they look at how the ETI program have, say, as for example, impacted on the ratio of the youth within the labor market. But I think what's also quite interesting to look at, which is what we're focused on here, is how does it affect the outcome of the individual that's gone through the program? So, for example, do these individuals enjoy faster wage growth after they finish the program? Do they last longer in the labor market? And you'll see why these are important questions as we go. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about what the ETI is, but the key take away from here is that it was launched in 2014 and it's targeted at youth between the age of 18 and 29. And you can only claim subsidy based on the program for up to 24 months. You have to be earning less than 6,000 rands per month for you to qualify. And it's, yeah. And you can't claim for a family member that's working in your company. So if you have a family-owned business, you can't really just tell your child to come and submit. You can submit a claim against your child who's working for you within the program. It's been ongoing. I think it was renewed about two or 3 years ago for another 4 years. So yeah, that's the basic premise of what the ETI program is. Okay, so the key questions and objectives of this study is to ask the question: Do wage subsidy programs have persistent effects on employment and wages after they've ended, and how do firm characteristics impact on these persistent effects? And the data that I've used for this is the administrative tax data. So this is basically data that's been extracted from individual tax filing of people and the company income tax filing as well. So when you file your taxes, there's a lot of information that's there that can be used for analysis. So for example, your income, we can extract the age, we can extract the gender, how long you've been working, and some of these other attributes that can help us determine what are the drivers of some of the outcomes that we're interested in. And for our data, the approach that we use is we from this data that's available at the National Treasury, we divide the data into what we call tax year cohorts. So we looked at data from 2014 to 2017, and for the 2014 year, we look at all youth between the ages of 18 to 29 who got the first job in the year 2014 and whose income is below 6,000, right? And we track this youth over time. So we look at you, we pick you, this is you in the year 2014, and we want to look at how your life changes as time goes. So that's the basic premise of how we try to understand the impact of ETI on the youth. So for this sample that we take, we track individuals for the year 2014. So if you got your first job in 2014, we track you all the way up until 2020. If you got your first job in 2015 as well. We track you all the way to 2020, and then we do that all the way up until 2027 and 2017. And then we look at all these individuals based on some of these characteristics that we're interested in. And the other thing that we're also interested in is how firm, so the firm that you worked with. So let's say you worked for a firm that's a very large firm. What does that mean for how long you survive in the labor market? If you worked for a firm that's very productive, does that have a strong implication for how long you last in the labor market? And this made us have to make two decisions about how we want to explore this data. Because you have a lot of individuals who, in the first year of their employment, they have multiple jobs. It's not just one job. And how do you track these individuals across time? So we divide our analysis into two separate kinds of analysis. One, we're just tracking you if you're employed. So we just signal this individual was employed in 2014, 2015, 2016, and what do they look like in subsequent years? And then in another data, we track you based on all the jobs that you have in your first year. And this matters for a number of reasons. So you'll find that a lot of youth have multiple jobs across the different years. And we want to be able to see what the implications of having multiple jobs is for future job prospects. We also want to see what the implication of just being employed at all is for future prospects in terms of how long you last in the labor market. And then we look at issues of how that impacts on your wage growth as well. So there's the clean database that we work with, and if you look at it quickly, we have what you call ETI. These are individuals that have jobs that are based on the wage subsidy program. Basically, when you work for this firm, they can claim some cashback, a rebate from the government by hiring you. And then you have what we call the non-ETI jobs. These are jobs that are not based on the program. And you'll see that over the years, the take-up of the program has increased. So for example, in 2014, only 60,000 of the total 380,000 jobs for people within the ages of 18 to 29 who were earning less than 6,000 rands, only 16%, which is about 60,000 of that were ETI jobs. And as you go down up until 2017, you'll find that almost 52% of these new jobs for new workers was ETI jobs. And if you just look at employment in general, like whether you were employed or not in ETI, the take-up is still improving over time. Okay, and what does this look like in terms of the nature of the firm that's taken up that's hiring people under this program? We find that it's mostly local firms as opposed to foreign firms that are hiring individuals on the ETI. Find that a lot of the firms that hire on the ETI are predominantly firms that trade. It's relatively larger firms in terms of their output, the gross sales, the capital, even the size of the firm. So what we see is it's larger, more successful, larger, more successful firms that are the ones that are hiring individuals with ETI. The only part where you have a slightly smaller characteristic is the value added, where it's slightly less productive firms that are the ones hiring ETI workers. Okay, so what does this look like? The way we want to look at this is how long do youth last in the labor market, because this is very important for whatever kind of solutions that Africa is trying to present for solving this youth employment issue. If we have programs that get them employed, but they don't last in the labor market, then the problem persists. But if we have a program that gets them employed and helps them to stay in the labor market for much longer, then there might be some sort of success that we can extract from this program. So if you look at the total, if you can just, it's okay if we focus on just the left side of this table, we'll see that for example, for all the youth that were employed, that got jobs based on in 2014, about 44% of them remained in the labor market by 2020. And if you look at, for example, in 2017, of the 395,000 youth that were employed in 2017, about 46% remained in the labor market by 2020. So you can see the churn is quite high. So quite a lot of youth are falling out of the the labor market within a short period of being employed. And that's a problem. So you can have all these programs that get them employed, but if they don't stay in the labor market, that's not really going to solve some of the issues that we're trying to solve. And if we look at this same data based on gender to see whether or not women are being are falling out of the labor market faster than men, we see that that might be the case. So if you look, for example, for the ratio of women to men that were employed for the first time in 2014 is 55 to 45%. And when you look at how many of them remain in the labor market in 2020, you have a slightly higher ratio of the women still there than they were in 2014. So it's the survival of women is a bit better. But as you look at subsequent years, it's not so much better. It's actually worse. So if you look at 2017 cohorts, for example, 51% of the people who were first-time workers in 2017, by 2020, 53% of the men remained, whereas it's only 47% of the women. So it might be a bit more, this not lasting in the labor market might be a bit worse off for women than it is for men. If we look at just the ETI program itself and just looking at whether or not just take up of the ETI program is already helping with the ETI, with this female to male survival in the labor market, we don't actually see much of a difference. So if you look at 2014, for example, in 2014, 53% were male and 47% were female. By 2020, it's 54% male, 46% female. So it's falling down slightly. 2017, again, you look at it, it's about 50-50, there were male, female, but by 2020, it's 48% of the female remain. So there's a slight punitive measure on women than it is for men, even within the ETI, within the employment initiative program, within the ETI program. So the question that we now want to see is, what are the drivers of these differences? Is the ETI helping people to last longer in the labor market? Because if it is, then it's something that we need to look into a bit deeper. So these two graphs, I need to spend just about a minute to explain it to you. On the left side, we have a graph looking at your first job and how long you last in your first job in the labor market. And the red line is for ETI jobs and the green line is for non-ETI jobs. And we can see in terms of staying in your first job in the labor market, there's not much of a difference between ETI and non-ETI. But if we look at survival across any kind of jobs, that is, you just employ, we don't care if you've stayed within the same job or if you've moved jobs. You start to see that ETI actually plays a significant role in keeping people in the labor market. So you'll see when we say base year +1 +2, this is just the number of years after your first job that you're still in the labor market. And you see there's a decent gap between those who just come in the market without any kind of subsidy program in place and those who come into the program based on ETI. So what we're saying is there might be a good role that's being played by this employment tax initiative in keeping people employed for long. But if you just take these as gospel, you might be wrong. We need to make sure that these are not just because people who end up signing up into the program tend to stay in the labor market longer. We need to make sure that it's not other compounding factors that are driving these differences. But one of the reasons that we're seeing this gap between the ETI and non-ETI is because ETI workers tend to have a number of jobs at the same time. Remember at the beginning of the presentation, I spoke about how people tend to have multiple jobs in the same year. So you will see that for non-ETI workers versus ETI workers, they tend to have about 1.3 jobs per person, whereas with non-ETI workers, it's about 1.2. And because of this, what's driving the gap between the ETI and non-ETI workers in terms of having any kind of job at all is because these guys tend to have a lot more employment, a lot more jobs that they can switch between. And that might be driving their job mobility in a certain way. So if you've worked 3 or 4 different kinds of jobs, it's easier for you to transition to another job in the future, as opposed to if you just worked one job the whole time. So they might not have the same level of job stability, but in terms of transitioning to a different kind of job, the ETI workers are a bit stronger in that regard. What about the wage story? How do ETI participants measure up against non-ETI participants? If you want to, just to give you a quick way to look at this graph, you want to focus on the blue and the and the red. So you'll see on the left-hand side, you have the blue here, which is an ETI worker in 2015, and the red is a non-ETI worker in 2015. And you'll see that by the time they get to 2020, which is the green and the orange graphs, there's been a shift to the right of the wages of these individuals, which means that there's a significant wage growth for both ETI and non-ETI workers. But this growth is a bit more in the labor market. And you'll find that with ETI workers are still growing a bit faster than they might be growing at a faster rate than non-ETI workers, but they all start from a lower point than their non-ETI counterparts. I'm going to move to a quick empirical outcomes right now, because we need to make sure that whatever it is we're seeing, it's not just because of the characteristics of the individuals we're looking at, but that actually this program is driving the survival of individuals in the labor market in the long term. So basically what we're looking at is, I'm looking at an individual, the survival of individual I at firm F and the time in time T and all subsequent time periods thereafter. And I'm trying to determine what are the drivers of this individual survival in the labor market. And obviously, I've already kind of touched on some of the things that might be driving our results not to be trusted. You might not want to trust my results if, for example, I can tell you that there's firms that in a systematic manner select ETI workers to come work for them. So it's all you're saying is just the effect of the firm on labor market outcomes as opposed to the effect of the program itself. Or it could be innate characteristics of these individuals that's driving them to survive in the labor market, and it's not the ETI program itself. So we have to control for individual characteristics and also try to conduct our analysis in such a way that we look at two individuals that are very similar to each other before one of them is hired as an ETI youth, and one is not hired as an ETI youth, and you look at how their life changes thereafter. That way we can see that it's not just about these people being different, but it's because of the ETI program itself that's driving whatever we see in terms of their outcomes. So the first regression results that I'm showing you here is telling us that if we control for the individual's income, we control for their age, we control for their gender, right? We find that ETI, people who got their first job as an ETI job, had at least one job that was an ETI job in their first year of them entering the labor market, tend to survive slightly better than those who got their first job that was not an ETI job. What this means is that ETI is having a significant effect in terms of driving the survival of youth in the labor market, up to 4 periods from their first job. After that, we don't really see any kind of difference between ETI and non-ETI workers. We see that the income that you start with, so the people who start with lower income tend to survive less, and people who start with higher incomes tend to survive longer. And this is consistent with some of the theories in economics that, if you start with a higher income, it means you're more productive, and the firms tend to try to keep you employed as long as possible. Age matters, gender matters as well, in the sense that we see women might be able to keep their jobs a bit longer than men within this regression. If we now, and all of this control for firm fixed effects, meaning that we're looking at survival within the firm, not just survival across board, because we want to make sure that what's driving this survival is not the firm, but it's the fact that you've participated in the ETI program. If we now bring in firm characteristics just to see how do firm characteristics affect the potential of you to survive in the market, in the labor market much longer, what we find is that it's not necessarily that it's the firm characteristics that's driving, or there's no premium on the characteristics of the firm with which you work that might be changing your prospects of survival based on the ETI. We find, yes, firm size might matter in terms of the larger the firm, you might not survive as much based on if you're an ETI participant, but that's only in the first period. In subsequent periods, it doesn't really matter. What about the wages? Average wage growth we showed you grew quite significantly for everybody. But what we're finding is for those who've gotten their first job through the ETI program, the average wage growth for these individuals. So if you see these numbers here at the top, it's negative and it's significant. It means that those who got their first job and didn't get it through ETI tend to see their wages grow faster than those who got their first job via ETI. And I'm not really sure why this is. We're still exploring to see how we might be able to explain this. But what we also see is that there is no, the only thing that might be able to reduce the gap between, the growth rates, the difference is, the gap between the wage growth rate of ETI workers and non-ETI workers is if you get your first job with a very productive firm. So ETI workers that get the first job in the productive firm won't have as large a gap in terms of their in terms of their income growth in comparison to non-ETI workers. There's a host of other regression and analysis that we do, but the crux of it is that one, employment survival is significantly improved if you get your first job or your first employment under the ETI program, and the firm that you get your first employment with doesn't really reduce your chances of survival. If anything, if you get your first job with a very productive firm, it might improve your chances of survival. And the same story is with the wage effects as well. The wage effects, we see ETI workers tend to have lower wage growth than non-ETI workers. And if you get your first job with a productive firm, the gap between you and your non-ETI counterparts is reduced. We do some other. Are we done? Yes. Okay. But that's it. Just a quick wrap up. I think I've already given you a very quick wrap up of the conclusion, which is that ETI matters. It's doing some good work. We might need to find ways to better target this policy because it's a very expensive program by the government, to make sure that it's the firms that are making it much more successful that we're targeting with the policy. And the wage effects, we might need to look at that a bit stronger in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that presentation. I'm sorry the time goes so quickly when you're presenting, but we will have a question and answer session later. And now Justin's going to present from the end.
Hey, great. Hi, everyone. Hope you're well. So starting at the very top, or the bigger picture, what I want you all to think about is that industrial policy doesn't just happen in some national vacuum. It happens in a place. It happens in a locality. And in fact, that locality really matters, right? The institutions, the resources, the governance, all of those factors collectively come together. So the dynamics of what's happening in places and cities in particular are really important as part of this ingredient in thinking about better industrial policy. So this paper in particular looks at cities as key mechanisms. If we think about economic development, it's not just even like butter on your toast. It's very lumpy, right? It happens, it concentrates in certain places because of the clustering, downstream supplies, a whole lot of economic reasons. So the underlying question of this paper is essentially, could cities in South Africa contribute more to economic growth and job creation? Are they living up to their potential as sort of engine rooms for growth? And we provide a partial answer in this paper by focusing particularly on productivity, because productivity is ultimately what a number of econometric studies show drives growth. It's one of the biggest aspects of that performance. And so the proposition is that productivity should be higher in our cities than the rest of South Africa if they are functioning appropriately and taking advantage of the economic effects. There's a whole lot of theory, urban economic theory behind it. And it's sometimes referred to as agglomeration economies. In other words, you know, the density or the concentration of firms or individuals together. But in many respects, it can be a bit of a mystery as to why, when firms or people cluster together, why are they more productive? And there could be a number of mechanisms responsible for it. Two broad sort of groups of thought. The one is that it happens in terms of your particular value chain or a particular industry. So you can think that they're workers, let's say we've got a textile clusters, then you've got workers with the sort of skills in that area. They get drawn in, and then the firms can share and access that pool of labor. Right, you might find that it can create specialist suppliers downstream and upstream, because now the market's bigger and you've got a whole group of textile producers together. That specialization can help drive productivity. So, a range of channels around sharing of labor pools, better matching between the skills that are needed for the firms, a third aspect can also be in terms of the knowledge and the innovation, copying one another. So that would be sort of localization economies. The other way of thinking about it is what a term called urbanization economies. And that's the big idea is, well, bigger cities are better because it's something about the diversity of industry where they can be sort of copying across sectors and sharing in many dynamic and unforeseen ways. So that would be your biggest economies being most important for growth, and different sorts of dynamics go on there. The international literature mostly focuses on the global north, but there's a very strong empirical relationship. The World Bank, for instance, says double your city size, your productivity of your firms in that area go up between 2 and 5%. South African cities and African cities face many challenges, right? We see countless examples in the newspaper of poor governance, mismanagement. So whilst cities could and have the potential to increase productivity, the diseconomies of congestion, pollution, poor governance could be working against them. What we do in this paper is make use of some original evidence, SARS tax data. So David Fadiran's been talking about that tax data. But in this case, what we focus on is what's happening spatially with the data. And why that's important is that a lot of the information we have is only released by StatSA at a national level. So what's holding back a lot of analysis about industrial policy in space is that we haven't had enough good, solid economic data. So part of the breakthrough in doing this sort of work is we need better data around what's happening in places and spaces. I'll talk in some of the details. Just to have a punt for the data itself, we've been involved as the HSRC in a project to make this sort of data more available. So if you go to spatialtaxdata.org.za, there's a portal for you to explore it. You can pick your particular municipality and get some nice indicators, can help you think about the local economy in your particular area. And for the metros, we can even spatialize it down to a hexagon or suburb layer. You can see that picture of Cape Town and the density of firms there. So go and have a play with that data. And a range of outputs that's been related to the spatial tax panel. Right. So what about some policy messages? What do we find? I think the first thing to realize is that metros certainly show their economic potential when you look at the concentration of jobs versus the concentration of population in South Africa. These jobs are from tax data, so it's only formal employment. But recall, formal employment in South Africa is a very large share. It's about 80% of all jobs. And in terms of GDP, it's about 95% of all jobs. Or 95% of all GDP. So it's a large share. The gray bar shows you that in the Gauteng metros, it's the highest concentration of jobs, almost 4 million. And then the coastal metros, second ranked, secondary cities, third ranked, large towns, then small towns and mostly rural areas. But what's very striking is when you add the population that they're serving on top of that. So whilst in the Gauteng metros, you've got about 30, just get my ratio right there. You've got about 35 people supporting every 100 persons, in terms of 35 people with a formal job for 100 persons. If you go to the mostly rural area municipalities in South Africa, it's only 5 people with formal employment serving 100 of the population. So you see that mismatch between just the sheer size of the population and the economies they serve. Clearly, South African cities, very important. Also, their economies are more diverse. In the next slide, when you look at their composition, a bit of a delay. There we go. So you probably can't see the differentiation in the bars so well, but if you look right over to the far right, which is mostly rural municipalities, you can see that about half of their economy is actually related to government, public services, education, and health. Right, so actually a very small economic base, whereas the metros have much more diversified economies, bigger shares of manufacturing, a whole range of tradable services. So clearly the metros are anchors in terms of the diversity of their economy. Small towns, large towns, secondary cities start to have higher shares in mining and also manufacturing to some degree, and agriculture. But those are your traditional industries. So when we're looking at the sort of diversification and propulsive industries, the metro is clearly important. So then what is the terms of the picture over time? We see that metros are important in terms of their economic muscle, but are they leading employment? Well, this graph shows a very mixed picture in terms of their performance. The tax data, that spatial tax data starts in 2014, so we've got about a 7-year period. And even the best performing city, that's the blue bar at the top, it's Cape Town, is still fairly modest. I think it's about a 3% compound aggregate growth rate. But when you look at Johannesburg, which is the orange bar, I mean, it only grows about 5% over the 7 years. So that's really low growth. That's very worrying that our major biggest economic agglomeration is performing quite poorly. Secondary cities, interestingly enough, and some small towns do a bit better. And I think it might have something to do with we've had quite a good agricultural cycle over the last 5 years, and the role of government over time. So essentially, it's a mixed picture. The big question is, are cities living up to their potential? If you're a firm and you're in a big city, do you get this premium in terms of your levels of productivity? So there's a lot of econometric work that needs to happen in terms of modeling productivity. But the basic idea is productivity is about you take inputs of capital, labor, materials, and you produce a certain amount of output. If you're more productive, you can take the same number of inputs and have more stuff, right? You produce more stuff. So productivity is about inputs being converted into outputs. And by measuring this total factor productivity, we can see how good are firms in terms of taking the inputs and generating more output. One technical thing to note is that when it comes to thinking about productivity at a spatial level, what do you do for firms with multiple branches, which is a large share of firms in South Africa? Do you treat them differently, or do they all have the same productivity? I don't know. It's a tricky business, but we make the assumption that all the branches have the same level of productivity, partially because we only have the balance sheet information to do so at the enterprise level. So just to note, multi-establishment firms, each of those establishments we're giving the same productivity level. I'm going to skip over the details of trying to model TFP in South Africa. And just to say, what's quite interesting is that because of the depth of the tax data, we can run it at a 2-digit SIC level. So that's 73 different industries. So that's really useful because you don't want to compare agriculture sector with making manufacturing. And in manufacturing, you don't want to compare steel production with textiles. So by doing it at the 2-digit level, we're getting quite a lot of control in terms of TFP by sector. So what do we find? Overall, the blue bar shows you the total factor productivity between these different settlement types. And the relationship is actually fairly weak. There's not a strong downward trend from most productive, highest blue bar to least productive. Although there is a slight sort of decrease as you move towards mostly rural municipalities. However, if we change our sample and only look at firms with single locations, because remember what I said, all big firms with branches everywhere, they are having the same productivity everywhere. So if we only look at single establishment firms, and these tend to be much smaller, small business, now you see a much clearer spatial pattern, and you see how the productivity starts to decline. The other thing to note about the relationship is when you start to look at it at the sectoral level, you see the important role of specialization. So in some ways, just talking about whether a city produces a productivity advantage can be better framed by saying, well, a productivity advantage in what area? And we see that different places have a different sort of role and have a different competitive and comparative advantage. So it's really important to be thinking about that particular local municipality and what it's good at and how to support it in the area that it's good at. So the table here shows the different sectors. The yellow means it's above average, and the green means it was the top performing place. And you can see some interesting trends. The far left is Johannesburg. So you do see actually Johannesburg having quite a significant premium, but it generally performing well in the service economy. So finance, professional services, etc. Whereas some of the other places like Nelson Mandela Bay, you can see stands out number one in terms of manufacturing, and we know that it's a big automotive producer. So the results generally align with our expectations about the economic specialization of different places. And you can see when it comes to larger towns, small towns, rural areas, things that crop up then are mining or agriculture. So where they have access to natural resources, natural endowments, that gives them the advantage. A big question has been around the role of firm size, which I showed you when we looked at the single location firms versus all firms. If you just put the total factor productivity into a regression to see the strength of the relationship, you do see that the geography predicts productivity, particularly for single location firms. But firm size itself is a much stronger predictor. The coefficients are a lot bigger. So it's a loose relationship. And focusing in on that relationship about firm size in different places, you can see the proportion of employment in the largest, in different firm sizes in this graph. So the top blue bar there is firms with more than 500. Next slide. The top blue bar is light blue bar is firms with more than 100, largest firms which have more than 500 employees. And you can see in most rural areas, they make up a quarter of all employment, whereas in sort of the Gauteng metros, coastal metros, it's only 7 or 6%. So there's a lot more small business in the bigger cities compared to small towns and rural municipalities. So they have a larger influence, a larger role to play. And when you take them out of the analysis, then you find that actually small firms are basically struggle to compete in smaller towns versus compared to bigger metros. So thinking about some ideas, why is there a loose relationship between cities and productivity in South Africa? Well, I think part of this comes down to thinking about how connected our city spaces are. So South African cities are classic examples of fragmented, sprawling townships far away from the economic cores. All of this means that they're not necessarily connected spaces. So if the magic of getting in the same place, getting in the same space creates productivity, you can see how if you don't have the economic investment and infrastructure to connect people, connect firms together, that can hold back development. There's also tended to be a bit of a political ambivalence about cities, when actually clearly cities have a very important role to play in leading economic growth in the country. A whole range of very tricky policy issues in terms of getting our cities to work better. So I'll end with a few big thoughts in terms of what this analysis might suggest. The one is the opportunity of large firms as anchors in local economies. So if you think about smaller peripheral municipalities, large firms there have a very big influence. And so what should perhaps governance needs to try and co-opt them in terms of helping with enhancing skills, developing local supplier bases, attracting talent. They could be seen as key accounts for service delivery. So big business sometimes gets a bad rap, but I think they should be seen as anchors or potential partners in smaller towns and smaller municipalities. The second is that small firms themselves are really important for our future, and cities here have a key role to play. You can see that small firms struggle to survive outside of the cities. And so having more efficient functioning metro economies is really important as playing that incubation role. The third thing for us to take home for us is around sector specialization. So rather than it viewing as a sort of winner takes all, biggest is best kind of logic of urban economics, I think we need to have a more nuanced approach to say, well, what is the particular competitive advantage of this place and between cities, right? It's not just about Johannesburg's not the same as Durban. It has different sorts of capabilities. Do we appreciate those capabilities? What does our industrial policy mean? Because it has implications for some places rather than others. And then the last advantage is that by thinking of what's happening in a particular area or place, it can be an easy way to start tackling real issues that matter and getting people around the table. So we've seen success with sort of Operation Vulindlela, but I think we need to see more of this at a local level. Business, government, community coming together in particular areas and saying, what is the potential in this place, and approaching it from that perspective. It breaks down silos. It's a good way to try and tackle issues. So I think I've taken all my time. I'll close it there. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that. So I hope your questions are brewing. If you're online, please pop your questions in the chat box. If you would like to put your question out live, you're also welcome to put your hand up if you're online. But now we're going to go to the third presentation from Ebrahim-Khalil Hassen.
While they're setting up, I last spoke at the TIPS conference in the year 2000. So yeah, I was just out of university, and the topic of my presentation was infrastructure and employment growth. If only government had listened. Okay, so I'm going to go through this presentation. There's a fair amount to go through. So I'm going to speak about the skills we have and the skills we need. But before that, I have a bit of a punter and editorial. I now work at the GCRO, the Gauteng City Research Observatory. We do very much work that Justin was speaking about. And what we're going to be looking at specifically in terms of industrial policy is looking at the relationship between sectors and spaces. Again, what Justin said. Justin's like one of our key guys that we rely on. Yeah, so this is an invitation for people working in government or in research institutions or whatever. We are setting up the program. We're looking for opportunities to engage. And you'll see why, because this is kind of a subset of the documents that we've been going through. There's a lot of them. And every one of them speak a little bit about skills. And they speak a little bit about localization. And they speak a little bit about this. And altogether, we're not sure that they cohere. So we're very much interested in partnering with different organizations, particularly if you have a specialization. We're never going to be specialists in terms of agriculture, whatever. So yeah. So that's the editorial. So I'm going to speak about so the background to this project. So the project actually was done before I started at the GCRO, when I was a consultant, for something called the Labor Market Intelligence Partnership. So it's a grouping that involves Department of Higher Education, a range of other stakeholders involved in skills. And they said, let's look at government policies and try and inform what is called the OIHD, the occupations in high demand. And when they discussed this with me, someone jokingly said, this is a fool's errand. And I replied, well, send a fool to do it. In other words, me. Now, I think when we went into this, we were quite clear that there was a gap in the level of specificity in government documents. And so what we started to look at, some issues here. So one of the things we looked at was, for instance, work done by Andre Krag, which looks at challenging how we look at skills and basically saying jobs, jobs, jobs. It's not only about high skilled perspective. It's about low skills. A more sort of recent paper by Stephanie Allays argues for new conceptual tools that are needed. And basically says that you can fix the CETAs or whatever, but unless the economic strategy is improved, you're not actually going to get the outcomes that you want. And so in the process of doing this work, one of the key outputs was this, which is called skill supply and demand in South Africa, which informs the critical skills list, etc. And so, yeah, I mean, so that's where we were. And what we then began to look at was to map out the process. I'm not going to go through all of this here, but people will understand. I mean, these are individuals on that side, there's employers on that side. And the point of skills and skills development is trying to get a match between the two. I mean, if skills development was working, you'd get a match between young people seeking work and firms that are employing people. So I mean, some of the stuff that David spoke about earlier. I'm not going to go through all of this here because you'd need probably an entire conference and people much more clever than me to get through all of that. What we're going to look at is looking at some sort of issues that emerge in terms of the demand for skills. Okay, so I'm going to go through the methods and findings. So just take a switch, because a lot of the presentations this morning have been kind of more sort of econometric type studies. The study is very much a qualitative, it takes a qualitative, inductive sort of approach. So what we did is we reviewed 39 economic policies, and we were really looking to seek to identify patterns, very much an inductive analysis. So we went into each of these documents, read through them, looked for what the departments were saying. The idea being is that rather than coming with a new strategy from the top, like a new sort of, whatever is fancy at the moment, as our politicians like to do, was to say, let's try and work with what there is there, where there's already committed resources, where we can begin to select projects and scale them. And to do that, we created two sorts of analytical tools. The one we call a completion matrix. So if you move from the top, we were looking at whether there's actually just a policy statement about skills within government economic policies. At the second level, we're looking at the policy sort of implementation, whether there's some resources, some sort of partnerships, some basis to actually carry the work forward. And then the final point is that we're looking for actually job level information. Why job level information is important is because that's actually what you get in the advert in the newspaper or the advert that comes out on your WhatsApp, which will say, we're looking for an administrative assistant. These are the characteristics that we're looking for. The other important bit is that if we have job level information, we're able to link the economic policy to what's happening within the CETAs, right? And I'll speak a little bit more about that. So that was the first sort of analytical tool, basically looking at what information is available. The second one, which is probably more familiar to people, is it basically looks at the labor intensity of the project of the policies. So whether policies are ambitious about employment creation or not, on the one axis, and then secondly, it looks at what types of skills are policies targeting. So what information is available? Remember that first one I looked at, the triangle. So we can try and fill that out and explain to you guys what we found. These are the types of patterns that we got through. The first pattern is where, yes, there's a fair amount of information there within these policies. We can actually work with them. Pattern 2 is just a policy intent. I personally expected most of it to just be sitting at that point where people designing things like master plans, etc., just say, we need to focus on skills and there's not much else there. The third pattern, which was quite interesting and in a way surprising, was where you have both a policy intent and also job level information. So particularly if you look at like sectors, for instance, like bioprospecting, etc., or you look at 3D printing, these O's know their stuff. They know the policy, they know the changes in the economy, they know what jobs. You go to the government, the departmental budget, the resources, or whatever sort of policy implementation mechanism, and you find it's significantly lacking. Those are key policy finding that we found there. There's also some which have no skills, and I was a bit mean here. There is one policy which we said that didn't have any information, and that was the poetry sector master plan. I was being a bit mean with that one anyway. And the last one is where there's no job level information. So take a stop for a second and think in your heads in where you work. What would be the pattern that's most likely to be here? Because I'm going to do a bit of quants now. Wow, that worked cool. Okay. So you can see that. I mean that when you're ticking all boxes, 30% of all government policies have some level of information. We're not by any means saying it's perfect, but it's something that you can work with. The 3%, I told you, that's the sector plans. In fact, a lot of the sector plans, you actually need to search, the master plans, you actually need to search very, very hard for any sort of skills information. Pattern 3 was an interesting one because that's an opportunity to scale, because you have the information and you have the job, you have both a clear policy intent and you have job level information. So that's something which, if you work in industrial policy, this would be something that you would go to the CETA and marshal resources around, try and set up internships, work with universities, etc., so that the skill system begins to work. Okay, so now we're going to shift we're going to shift focus. That's the information, but what is the policy intent? So we start from a perspective which says that actually what you want to do is you want to have lots of jobs, and you want to have lots of low-skilled jobs. That's kind of where this green asterisk is. That's kind of the policy intent. If you read government policy, etc., that's what it's saying. Is that we need to have jobs. And when you look at the labor market, we understand that the majority of unemployed within the country have lower levels of education. That's the kind of policy intent that comes out. When we do the analysis, what sort of images come out through? The one thing, when I'll start on the top, so restructuring for the future. So it's a big part of most policies. It's about looking at the future and trying to plan for the future, adjusting for technological change primarily, right? So whichever sector one looks at, it's a big part of it. And I guess people are so excited by new jobs, the changes in the workplace, etc. And a lot of it is focused very much on high skill level jobs. And there is an argument, and I don't dispute this argument, that the more high level skill jobs we create, we'll be able to create lower jobs as well. That's the one approach. The second approach, which I've put here, is sort of a high sort of labor intensity and low skilled, very much coming through since the Ramaphosa administration, the presidential employment stimulus plan, very much focused around what is called as demand responsive sort of approaches. So whether it's looking at the national pathway management for youth, but basically what it's saying is that we need to find within this economy the sectors which can absorb this large number of people that are unemployed. So that's an interesting one. I mean, I have some issues around the design of the program and whether it treats youth unemployment as an informational asymmetry and tries to solve it through an app versus a structural sort of approach. But at least it's a step in the direction. And then there's this thing here, which is outside of this here, which is we need a process. It's amazing at the number of, particularly the master plans, that have no information in terms of what they're going to do about skills, except they're going to set up a committee. Right? I mean, I mean, we laugh about this here, but it's actually an indictment on where we are. Then we have this squiggly. Well, I need to go one back. Oh, there we go. Then we have the squiggly line, which is another favorite in government, which is that everything must be coordinated and integrated. Right? So, and these things, they speak about everything. So that's why this line goes like everywhere. They don't really speak about lower skill jobs in a lot of ways. The one exception, and is actually the latest Job Summit Framework Agreement. And my sort of takeaway from all of these points is that if we had just implemented that and done nothing else, done no other policy or anything, we'd have been in a much better position in terms of employment outcomes. than this, this plethora of policy documents that are in there. So my favorite example from there is what is planned in the West Rand of Gauteng. Justin's point, it happens within a space. There's an extensive process outlined around how the West Rand in Gauteng would transition from a deep level gold mining to agro-processing. It's detailed. It's there. It says gold miners are going to do this. We're going to have a college, etc., etc. It says high level of detail. But when you actually go there and see the level of implementation a few years later, it's actually disappointing, right? It's actually disappointing over a period of time. But we try and be positive. So we commend government for at least getting that point. The question then becomes, and you can fill the policy documents up. The question then becomes a question of implementation, which is what I'm going to go through next. So in terms of themes, so this picture in the background is actually it's a primary school in Grassy Park in Cape Town. It's one of the leading sort of coding schools in the country, and the principal, Ridwan, I forget his surname, was asked a very interesting question a few weeks back on the radio, and he was asking, so what sort of languages should kids be learn in terms of coding? He said, no, that's not the issue here. The issue is that kids must learn problem solving. And it just like blew my mind when I listened to this podcast, because AI is basically in a lot of ways taken over a lot of the coding functions. But if we're training our young people to actually go in and learn problem solving. So I thought this was because this is like one of the case studies, one of the success stories. So I thought I'd put that picture up because it really was quite an eye-opener for me. I'll be fine. Okay, so in terms of lessons, policy documents. There's this thing in terms of coding called version control. So you get like 0.01. When you update Microsoft Word. Right? My big recommendation for today, ladies and gentlemen, is that all policy documents should have a version control. So we know which document we're actually speaking about. Right? It sounds silly. It sounds almost inane. But if you meet with investors, as we've started to meet with now in the Gauteng City region, they absolutely do not even understand which is the latest policy document. And myself as a researcher going into this year, finding the latest master plan is actually quite difficult. Finding it's absolutely, if we can't get that level of policy certainty right, more complex stuff is out of the way. So it sounds trivial. People even think it's condescending, but it's true. Speak to investors, and they will tell you they don't actually understand which document they need to be looking at. The second set of issues is around coordination and coherence. So we have complex coordination mechanisms, right? So whether it's the IPEP, the master plan, the agricultural policy action plan, the infrastructure plan, the presidential employment stimulus, each one of these are complex coordination mechanisms that, depending on the politician, also need a level of social commitment. So some of these things go through NEDLAC, there's committees there, etc. But there's no clear policy objectives. What is the one thing? What is the one thing? We say it's jobs, but actually when you go through these processes, it's a whole lot of other things that are there. And so you can't cohere around a set of ideas, a set of actions without a central idea. I've mentioned this already, but our policy choices often valorize technological change. And that's great. I mean, I'm a techie. I love coding and all of it. The reality is that we need to look at not the skills we want to have in the future. And this is the title of the presentation, the skills we have. What does it mean for somebody growing up in the small towns that Justin spoke about, where there's a high level of dependency? What does it mean for that young adult that has entered the labor market? And David spoke about this in terms of the ETI, who's maybe able to get the first job, but not be able to sustain being in employment over a period of time. So it's really important. The third sort of issue is a link between the CETA and the policy making is fragmented. And I think we knew this here. What was interesting is that once you compare, and we did this analysis, once you compare what's actually in the sector plans and the documents. So if you do, just an example, you take agriculture sector plan, and you take the agricultural documents, and they're required to report, because the government realizes that this is important. They're required to report on the alignments. go and read it. I mean, my takeaway from there is that there's actually not a serious process within the CETAs. And the CETA people argue with me, and I've said, okay, if there is a serious process, show it to me. And so far, I haven't managed to see. So it's about pushing to make sure that actually that alignment happens. What's great about the CETAs, though, is that it provides a fairly accurate estimation of demand. And even if we start from there, I mean, that's at least a step in the right direction. It's all not doom and gloom. There's some great examples in Gauteng. We now have the solar technicians, etc. We have no strategy of actually selecting for things for scaling. So you can do 50 things, and that's fine. You know, I mean, you can experiment. Out of those 50 things, what are the 2 or 3 things that we're going to focus on? Am I good for time? Okay. The other point is that small businesses emergence is a significant but a generic beneficiary and agent. So I can go in for hours on speaking about this here. But every plan speaks about building the skills of small businesses, which is fine. I mean, there's again an issue around generic sort of training versus more sort of specialized sort of training versus actually just sort of incubation and support. And I don't think those are clarified. So what I'm saying is that if we anticipate, as some documents do, that small businesses will be the solution to our employment crisis, we're going to be found wanting. There's green shoots. I've spoken about this here. The demand responsive processes are a step in the right direction. The big one for me was that there is no link, and that's why I've read it as a separate between the policies and first job work experiences. Very, very thin in terms of the policies. And so this is kind of the map that we're working with at the GCRO. Is that if we want our programs to work, and we don't know how to do this here, so I'm not going to pretend like we understand this here. We're at the start of a process. Is that if we want policies to work, they need to be structural in the sense that they make some sort of bigger change within the economy, and they also need to be programmatic. You know, so you move away from small. So what we see particularly within the Gauteng province and local governments is lots of small projects that never ever actually scale, but also don't have a big impact in terms of changing the structure of the economy. So ideally, this is what you'd want to go to. My final slide, which is kind of the take-home point for me, and I think what we need to be speaking about. Philosophers speak about this fancy term called axiological, which basically refers to the study of value. What are the things that we value within our policies, within our allocation of resources? And so for us at the GCRO, it's going to be about employment-focused regional and local initiatives. Where you sit as well, I mean, it's about making employment core to what we do. And that's not just a politician's type of point of jobs. It's about how one begins to internalize this reality of being basically the country with the world's highest unemployment, also the world's highest inequality, and how we actually move forward. And so one of the things which I found quite interesting, and it's a thought, I mean, I'm not sure, is that what would happen to our employment policies is a thought experiment. If we say that every employment policy needs to provide a right to first work experience. So across the board, as a rule, across all of this here, I think we'd have much better impacts than we currently have. So to conclude, I mean, I hope that in 23 years' time when I speak again, as we say in my religion, inshallah, that we don't come to a country where we still have such high rates of unemployment and inequality. You know, and I think it starts here. So long after we're gone, you know, what is this country going to be? And I think that although I've presented a very critical view of this thing, it's kind of our job as researchers, there's enough to work with there to actually make this change from sort of more general sort of policy commitments to actually action on the ground that actually scales over a period of time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that presentation. I hope in 23 years, if we're all back here, we're solving different problems to these ones. I want to open up now for a round of questions, first from the floor, and then we'll take a round online. We'll possibly have the option to do 2 rounds of questions, depending on how we manage our time. Masana, you are. Thank you. Anyone else has a question? Okay, and then just at the table behind you.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentations. I'm actually quite happy I joined this session. I stayed away from the common energy transition part, and this was quite helpful. A couple of questions, and very brief as well. On the last presentation, what is the linkage with this fragmented policy space and just the element of political will? Is it, do you see a linkage with that? And is the lack of political will coming out in how these policies are actually structured? And then for Justin, with regards to, obviously the cities are quite important. At the same time, we are against urbanization. So how do we need to balance those two? I'll be interested to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Yes, 2 more there, and there's 1 more question there. Let's make that the first round. Are there any questions online? Not yet. Okay.
All right. Thank you. I've got 2 questions. The first one, which relates to issues of employment. Now, given that South Africa has got a lot of legal and illegal migrants, is there a way of solving this case where you find that employers, especially in the private sector, they want to cut costs and maximize on profits? So there's now abundant labor, and you find that foreigners, some of them, they are desperate for anything that brings income to them and food on the table. And they are able to take even jobs which pay wages or salaries which are below the market related. And you find that in some cases, others, they may not be willing to take those jobs. And as a result, they are unemployed. So that's happening in the private sector. Then secondly, how do we address issues which relate to policy conflicts? For example, you find that the government offers funding even to foreigners to do their studies here. And that's an investment in human capital. And I would think that when the government invests in them, then the government should also reap some benefits from that. If it doesn't reap the benefits, then it's just expenditure on them and the government is not benefiting. But at the same time, you find that, for example, for one to do PhD, that can cost maybe around 48,000, depending on the university. But at the same time, previously, the government used to allow those PhD holders to apply for permanent residence where they can legalize their stay and work. And currently, it's scrapped off by the current minister. So therefore, such issues where the government is investing, but it's also not reaping from that, those issues, how can they be tackled? Thank you.
No, thanks very much. The one is directed at Ebrahim. My interest is the initial slides focused on supply and demand, but much of your presentation focuses on the demand side, whilst the part of the structural problem is the production of skills which are not in demand. And therefore, when those that continue to produce skills are not challenged, at all. So for me, it's quite interesting that, we don't refer to either universities or colleges and place demands on them, and especially their systems to develop a qualification at a university. A new qualification takes you about 5 years. Now, industry would have migrated, during that period. So by the time you have a qualification, it's no longer, some parts of it are no longer relevant. So that's the thing. The question for Justin, I think parts of it was raised that whilst you do not want to deny the focus on urban centers, part of a problem is that there's little or nothing said about the rural areas, wherein you're seeking to transform them into areas of economic activity. And therefore, the continued migration towards cities is what sometimes creates some of these social problems. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. My question is directed to Justin. So Justin, on your, what I wanted to get from your paper was the policy implication, especially when you talk about industrialization. So the question that I had was, how do you measure, what's your definition of cities in a regression model? That's number one. So the second question follows on that one is, you looked at the cost, at the relationship between cities and productivity. But in your presentation, I think you made the implicit assumption that cities directly translate into productivity. But now, because we're talking about policies, once you talk about relationship, I think the direction of relationship should come explicitly. So are you assuming that cities result in productivity, or productivity actually trick of jobs comes into play? When you talk about cities, what kind of cities are you talking about? Do you, like the question that was asked, do you want to develop cities in urban areas, or do you want to develop cities in rural areas? Because they have different job implications. Thank you so much.
I don't think any of the questions was directly directed at me. But I suppose I could touch on this issue of, you speak about, you invest, the cost of a PhD is way more expensive than the numbers you put out, because a lot of it is subsidized. So it's not 48,000, it's probably in the hundreds of thousands per year. But after that investment, you don't really reap the benefits because the individuals are not staying. Like, I'm not necessarily going to answer that question. I'm going to go back to what he said, because I think at the upper level of the skills of the skills categorization, I don't think that's where we have the biggest issue necessarily. I think it's at the lower levels of skills. And you'll see that a lot of the problems in South Africa, it's because you have a lot of youth that are, one, unskilled, and there are two, they're not employable. So like, even if you want to give this person a job, they don't have the skills to take up that job. And it goes back to what he was talking about in terms of, should some of this policy be demand side policies or supply side policies? Because if it's a supply side policy, it might not work the way you think, because 4 years later, you push all this new group of youth into the market. The industry has transitioned, they don't really need anymore, rather than supply side ones. But we've seen that some of the supply sides, I'm sorry, not been the most effective. So this initiative that I was discussing, the ETI, a lot of the studies that I've looked at it, I found that the numbers are not very good. The amount that's been spent on it is a lot. My paper is almost probably the most optimistic you'll find in terms of how effective the ETI has been, because we're looking at how individual capabilities have changed over time. But every other measure of whether or not this policy has been successful is not very, very optimistic, in the sense that we haven't seen an increase in the ratio of youth in the labor market. So my answer is not very, very helpful, in the sense that I don't think we've figured out the right way to go about this. A lot of the policies we have right now are not necessarily leading to the outcomes we wish. I think what we need is a very much more targeted policies in terms of industry location, where we find the places where these policies are most effective, and then we direct money towards there. Because otherwise, it's just a lot of money being poured to areas where some is just going to waste. It's not really coming back to us. That's where I'm going to stop for that. And that brings together a lot of the research that we've all been speaking about.
and I was asked some pretty big questions. So I'll have a little go at answering them. We can talk over lunch about it. The one is essentially, how do we approach the question of uneven development? And particularly in a country like South Africa, which has a huge spatial legacy. And it's not just about between different regions or between urban and rural, it's within cities, right? Between townships and the core. So this issue of spatial inequality is a really big one. And I think that the one approach to it is how we think of our different cities, which comes into that issue of the definition. I've got my colleague from the Gauteng City Region Observatory. So one way of doing it is framing it as, well, it's a city region, and that there are linkages between Johannesburg into the rural hinterland. I mean, I think it's difficult to disagree to say, well, if Johannesburg can really function optimally, it can create demand in rural areas, and that you can strengthen those interlinkages. So one way of framing it is not to say, well, it's not either or, it's both and. But I think the other thing to leave with you is to say, we need to develop the potential of every single municipality in every single place, right? So it's not just about Johannesburg or Cape Town performing well. It's about every region being able to perform well. But at the same time, we need to be realistic about their role in terms of the broader national economy, and that each different place has a different specialization, has a different competitive advantage. So an SEZ, because that's not the way the economy works, right? We need to select as the basis. And one last comment is to say that, yes, migration into cities, big issue. I think we need to be proactive about it. If it's infrastructure, once people are already there. So the opportunity is, as countries urbanize in South Africa and the rest of the continent, we need to be planning ahead so that we can get the right services, and to realize that migration is often a pathway out of poverty for many people. So we shouldn't be trying to restrict people's freedom of movement. I mean, that's going back to apartheid era days. That's not, I think, the wrong way of seeing it. Yes, people will be moving to cities for opportunities. We need to try and support that process so that it's productive, and deal with some of the push factors. Why are people leaving a whole lot of rural areas? Well, because we haven't developed the economy there. So rather than trying to keep people out, can we try and address some of?
So I can speak through lunch if people are interested. So I want to make three points. One is around a set of issues that were raised around political will, political conflicts, etc. So I think the government of South Africa, in a sense, is very powerful, and it's also very weak at the same time. So to give you an example, I joked about it 23 years ago, but at that point, I mean, I was working in the trade unions, and we had set up a process between the trade unions and business to argue for what? For greater investment in electricity generation, right? I mean, Thabo Mbeki's apologized for this like a little while back. And they were extremely powerful in terms of stopping that. Partly because they thought they could privatize parts of Eskom, etc. But at the same time, they were extremely weak with dealing with capital-intensive, energy-intensive industries, specifically the aluminium smelters in Richards Bay, right? Which basically, at the time, I don't know if it's still true, it basically takes enough energy like a small city. It's a guzzler. We have no alumina in South Africa. So it's this weird contradiction of government being very, very strong on things and being very weak in terms of, for instance, disciplining capital, or if you come from the other perspective, engaging with labor. So the point that I'm making is that what we have is a lot of action without sort of a credible commitment from government or from the parties. To illustrate with one example, and I don't want to belabor the point, but what's interesting about what has happened with the unemployment grant, the SRD, is the amount of research that shows a linkage between giving people a small amount of money and their ability to actually enter the labor market. There's no debate about this. It's like I've seen about now 9 studies, all different perspectives, all arguing the same thing, right? is there a basis, for instance, of a credible commitment across the social partners? Because I think you can get it, you know. So it's, yes, I mean, we have political conflicts. I mean, the Minister of Energy doesn't agree with this one. But at the end of the day, I mean, I think it's this curious dichotomy between strength and weakness and the inability to actually deal with this. Which comes to the second point, which is around the skills anticipation. So if you look at Singapore, I mean, there's a famous story, and part of it is about like telling the fairy tale, you know. So they received independence, etc. And one of the first things they did was they looked around and they saw what was actually working, and they started with fish hooks, like building like literally hooks that you could fish with, because you start with what you have, you know. And I think that is a problem that we have in terms of the issue that you raised in terms of skills anticipation. So I mean, I'm almost, in a sense, I'm flipping the question to say, what can we do to actually do something that's useful for a large chunk of our society that have low levels of skill and are unemployed? So that's the first point. The second point is in terms of skills anticipation. It's a very interesting area because I don't think that you're going to be able to ever precision it in a way that you're going to meet exact industry demands within the next 5 years. But if you speak to professional bodies, and if any of you guys speak to professional bodies, there's an amazing amount of skills, whether it's the engineers, the town planners, the doctors, they understand that. We also understand that if you're not having people coming through the system, you know, the throughput, you know, whether it's nurses or doctors, whatever, we're going to have a problem. You know, so there's a range of issues, and I don't want to simplify, because it is a big issue. And yes, I mean, if you speak to people in the private sector, they will argue that things move very, very slowly. And our universities as well. I mean, it's extremely frustrating. I work in a university environment. Even to do something like we want to do a course on Coursera, you know, it's this like online platform. Oh my word, it's like really like you know. So, but I mean, so you know, university bureaucracies are worse than governments. Okay, 30 seconds. On foreigners, I'm happy to take the conversation over lunchtime. All I'll say is this, is last month we replaced the headboards in our home, and we're trying to buy local. So we asked around and people sent us to this place. It was an Ethiopian guy that builds his headboards, and you can choose exactly the type of material. As you can see, I'm dressed very much in black, so I'm not a stylish person. But my teenage kids are stylish, so they chose exactly what they wanted. This Ethiopian guy employed a couple of obviously Ethiopian people, but there's a mini factory that's running. I actually asked to go not to the front shop, to actually go and see the factory. It was fascinating. So I think we mustn't kind of scapegoat foreigners as the problem. The problem is that our township economies in particular are not dynamic. And the question is how then we actually begin to deal with those economies. Personally, if foreigners are going to come in and build these light manufacturing industries in it, I say let them come. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I want to encourage you to send questions in the direction of these three scholars. If you've got any burning questions, grab them over lunch and hold them to the promise to keep talking over lunch. And if you are in a position where you can create or preserve decent work for anyone, even if it's in your household, I encourage you to do that. Thank you so much for today.